So what have we already learned? So just some observations. Again, this comes out of the Medicare Modernization Act experience, which gave $15 million, not a lot of money to HRQ. It's been increased over time. So I have four, and the stimulus experience. I have four issues that I think are important, I'll mention. One is the importance of the upfront, what we might call scoping question. That is, it's not only what treatment, what comparator. Obviously, those are the key issues. But it's more precisely and in a more refined way, how is this question being asked? So, and Thomas Phillipson got to this a little bit. It's not simply what treatment, it's what strategy, which could be a sequence, as he said, of treatments. You fail first line first, then you get to second line. It could be a package of services around treatment. It could be, a host of other things. Pharmaceuticals with diet and exercise and counseling, for example. But those questions that are being asked in the first place and the nature of the question, I think, is a critical component. We saw it as recently as a week or two ago when the Medtech, CMS Medicare Coverage Advisory Committee met about the ESAs, the erythropoietin stimulating agents, in the context of chronic kidney disease. Bob and I were just chatting about this. The questions that the committee asked in the first place really were very, very important, and it's always the case. Secondly, CMS is moving to this term relevant outcomes. And I'll share with you some data in a moment that my colleagues and I are collecting. And they have increasingly been raising the evidence bar and asking for what they're calling relevant outcomes. Don't give us surrogate markers, give us harder outcomes, longer-term outcomes. Don't give us general population data. Convince us that the technology really works for Medicare, it's relevant. Third, there's always a discussion of whether comparative effectiveness means really clinical trials or evidence syntheses. Now, typically it means both, and what we've seen in the stimulus package is both. What we saw out of the MMA was mostly, if not all, evidence syntheses. So a lot of the science of comparative effectiveness research has been around how you do evidence syntheses, which is really, I'd argue, a sort of a legitimate body of science or inquiry. How do you select evidence or studies in the first place to look at what inclusion-exclusion criteria? How do you control in non-randomized environments? There's a lot of statistical issues and so forth. If we're talking about $500 million a year in the future, we're probably talking about doing some trials as well as doing a lot of evidence syntheses. But I think really the impact will be in the evidence syntheses, because you can only do so many trials, even with $500 million. Finally, I'll get to the IOM report in a moment, but what the IOM, I think, said, and what HHS has been saying with the stimulus money, when you think about comparative effectiveness, you quickly get to data and infrastructure issues. You get to IT issues. Even though you might not think about that first, you think about, well, comparative effectiveness means, we're going to compare this versus that. But I think what you quickly realize is you need databases, you need infrastructure, you need IT, you need systems that capture information. And so that's part of the comparative effectiveness debate. Okay, my other point here is comparative effectiveness research, I already said it, by itself may not change practice. Now, there probably are exceptions where you really have a new study, a new trial that's done and it's definitive, but it's really the exception. The world of evidence is typically much more messy, which I think is what Thomas Phillipson was saying. Might work in one subgroup and not in another, some patients not in another. We learn some things, the field has advanced by the time the results are done. We learn that the treatment doesn't work any better, but safety is a little bit better, things like that. But I think the really important takeaway is it's in the context of payment and delivery reform that you need incentives to change behavior. Information alone likely only does so much to change behavior in the context of messy evidence. I think we saw it in the Katie trial, we saw it in the ALLHAT trial, we saw it in the stents bypass comparisons, and on and on and on. We haven't seen a lot of behavior change after those trials. Why? Well, we haven't changed incentives, and people still have incentives to do what they do, and you need bigger changes to get them to change, bigger changes in incentives to get them to change behavior.